Sometimes when I get ready for a game, I tend to write down detailed notes, things I want to talk about, that kind of thing, especially if I happen to be playing the game prior to or within relative time to knowing that I'm going to be looking at it. Half-Life 2 being an excellent example of that. Sometimes I don't take notes at all because I know the game so well and I know exactly what I want to talk about. Sometimes I try to do little bullet points, like I do here. This is actually the full extent, you probably can't see this at all, the full extent of my notes about Morrowind. Despite the enormity of the game, that's all I have written down because all I need is bullet points. It's Morrowind. You know how many times I've played Morrowind? Now, let's get a couple things out of the way right off the bat here. Very first thing, slap bang, okay? Morrowind is, in my opinion, overall debatably one of the best of the Elder Scrolls series. It's a very close tie, and for obvious reasons that I'll start getting into, but for all the interface and graphical and difficulties within Morrowind that exist and all the irritations for the gameplay, it makes up for that by being such a magnificent world and its general difference in design philosophy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about tonality, okay? When you see a game like Oblivion, well, okay, let's define something really quick, okay? I tend to use different definitions of high and low fantasy because I find the existing definitions to be pointless and stupid. Um, this is just a matter of opinion, and I tend to make it clear when I am saying high fantasy, I mean my definition, not the actual definition, which applies to just about everything. But for example, I tend to define high fantasy as something that is heavily magical, something that is very excessively of a fantastical nature, and to use a direct example, Warcraft, the setting of Warcraft in general, is something that I would consider very high fantasy. Something I would consider low fantasy is something that is much more down to earth, that still has fantasy elements, magic, different species, monsters, that kind of thing, or whatever, but is overall a lot more mundane about it. I consider Lord of the Rings to be a much more low fantasy in that sense. You get where I'm going with this? Actually, probably a better example would be something like the Witcher series, but you get the general concept here. The difference between the two has to do with a degree of severity within its tone. Now, Oblivion is actually kind of in the middle. I'll talk about this more when I get to Oblivion, but it's very cosmopolitan. It has its high fantasy elements, as I define them, but it also is very low fantasy. It is very mundane, very down-to-earth in many aspects thereof, and that's part of its charm, in my opinion. Skyrim is extremely low fantasy, in my opinion, in my definition thereof. It is very down-to-earth, it's very dirty. Virtually every form of magic in the game and fantastical element of the game exists on a day-to-day, down-to-earth level, if you understand where I'm going with it. And there are exceptions, of course, but the overall tonality of the entire game is down here. You understand where I'm going with this? All of this is to emphasize Morrowind, which is way up here. Morrowind is by far the most high fantasy of the Elder Scrolls, in my opinion, and that whole atmosphere, which is what I'm going to start talking about here in bits and pieces, is part of why I like this game so much. Someone once asked me on the Q&As what areas I would like to see in a future Elder Scrolls game. In Elder Scrolls 6, for example, or 5, or whatever we're up to. No, yeah, we're up to 6. We are, right? 3, 4. Yes, okay, sorry. I had that number confused for a long time. I don't remember why. But anyways, I would love to see I actually can't remember the name of it all of a sudden off the top of my head. The area where the Khajiit are from, and the Argonians, the southeast region, which is described as being very alien and very unique in its perception. I believe that would be an interesting direction to go into, especially immediately after the, much more gritty and dirty area of Skyrim, of the North, of the Nords. I think that would be fascinating to go into. And it's partially because I enjoy that type of fantasy so much. I enjoy that type of buildings made out of mushrooms that you grow in a specific manner, and giant insects that carry you to and from different locations, and a city that happens to be floating, that is being suspended by willpower and various other things, and just so many different aspects of Morrowind were so fantastical, and I loved that. I loved the atmosphere, and that's what I want to talk about first. One of the things, I'll talk about this in depth when I get to Half-Life 2. Yes, I may or may not upload this after my Half-Life 2 video, but I haven't actually done it yet. But I know one of the things I'm going to talk about is the idea of using lots of little details in order to flesh out a background, to give something a degree of atmosphere. I'll talk about that more later then. But Morrowind is something that does that quite well. Just about everything you see, from the trees to the foliage to the rocks to the way the roads are built to the monsters that are roaming around, or everything about Morrowind just screams that this is basically an alien world. It doesn't have, with some exceptions, your typical fantasy creatures or stuff. You know, you don't see too many ogres and elves and whatnot wandering around. Instead, what you see is things that look, frankly, alien. And it really helps contribute to that overall feeling that this is just practically another world, if you know what I'm getting at. And that's even talking within context of the lore. Obviously, as the gamer, as the person actually sitting here playing the game, you are thinking that this is a whole nother world, which is part of the point, and one of the other big advantages Morrowind has, which I'll get to later. On top of that, there is this wonderful design philosophy in the graphics to make things simultaneously mundane looking, you know, because they were trying for that realistic look. At the time, the graphics of Morrowind were nothing short of top notch. Admittedly, it's hard to go back to them, but at the time, the whole intent was to make things look relatively realistic, even though what you were looking at was something completely unrealistic, if that makes any sense. To make the unreal look real, to make things that looked like fantasy look like they existed side by side with things we know are real, like people and dirt and wood and stuff like that, and make it fit, which was an incredible achievement at the time, and a brilliant graphical design philosophy to go into this. I'm going to pause here to mention something that I actually probably should have mentioned first. There is a mod out there, whose proper name I don't know, I'm going to look it up right now as I'm talking about it, that has to do with improving the Morrowind engine. It's something that people have been working on for years upon years. Maybe this is it? Yes, this is it. The Morrowind Overhaul. Which is still being worked on, by the way, still being updated last I checked, which I suppose actually I could check the timestamps on these right now and see if it is in fact being updated. Looks like it is not, but it is basically done, and it's a way to make Morrowind more playable in the modern era. When I most recently played Morrowind, which is just a little over a year ago now, I was using the Morrowind Overhaul, in order to enjoy it, because I freely admit Morrowind is one of those games I have a hard time going back to just because of the limitations of the UI and the graphics. This is something I've talked about before. The Overhaul helps tremendously with all of that, and that is one of the great benefits of any given Bethesda game, is the fact that you can use mods and the kits that are available and the knowledge we have about the game in order to improve it, so you can still enjoy it later on. And I'll talk about that more in depth later, of course. But anyways, the point I'm getting to here is that I strongly recommend, if you have not played Morrowind, go ahead and pick it up. It's not particularly expensive. Make sure you get the Game of the Year edition. You definitely want both expansions with it. That would be Blood Moon and Tribunal. And do yourself a favor and pick up the Overhaul kit so you can enjoy it with slightly improved graphics and render radius and stuff like that. For me personally, the render radius was one of the biggest downsides of vanilla Morrowind. I've always had a weird thing about render radiuses, and it comes from living in an era and growing up in an era where, you know, we finally started doing 3D graphics in games, and the way that they got around the problems with that was by having the render radius be like 100 yards in front of you, which feels like you're in a dense fog to me, and it always felt claustrophobic. I always hated it. And even to this day, there are more modern games that I play, and I look out in the horizon and I see fog, and it's like, even though it's 2 miles out, it still bothers me a bit. That's always been a personal pet peeve of mine. And so the original Morrowind had that problem in spades, because there were literally instances of circumstances where you could draw your bow or your crossbow or whatever and aim at someone and hit someone who is basically just past the fog. And because of the way the game was designed, they couldn't actually register it, if you know what I mean. So you'd hit them. They'd take the damage, but, you know, nothing would happen because it's past render radius. That always bothered me. The Overhaul kit fixes that tremendously, so that is a nice thing. In addition to graphics, one of the things I want to talk about is the music. I love the music of Morrowind. Of the 3 modern Elder Scrolls games, I actually still listen to Morrowind music. It's on my iPod. It has a whole playlist dedicated just to it, just to Morrowind specifically. while I like the Oblivion music and some of the Skyrim songs, the Morrowind music was so incredibly atmospheric, and I hate to keep banging on that word, but I don't have a better word for it. It helps pull you in to such a severe degree that you can really feel like you're actually roaming this other world and actually engaging yourself in this other world, and it really added to the flavor, to the tone, to everything. It felt like this. The word I want to use is adventure, because that's really what it feels like to me. And I know that word is used and overused so much in the modern era that people tend to forget what it means. People tend to forget the feelings that it is supposed to convey. You know, adventure, something that you are actually genuinely enthusiastic about, something that actually makes you engaged and excited, and you're really into it, that kind of thing. That music helps bring that alive for me in Morrowind, especially given what I think I will go ahead and go into next. It is, in fact, my next bullet point here. Morrowind is the closest game I've ever played, ever, to D&D. Now, let me explain that a little bit. I've talked before in my D&D blogs, you may not have watched those, about how you can do basically anything within a D&D game within reason. You have a near total amount of freedom, depending on your GM, of course, because the game, in this case, the GM, is someone who is sentient and therefore capable of adapting to basically any type of circumstance, at least with some thought, right? A video game, by definition, is always going to be limited, and that's something that I have chafed against basically my whole life. This is one of the reasons I have been so into D&D for as long as I have, is because it is basically a way to engage in a societal, or not societal, a social interaction with other people, while at the same time playing a game that happens to be basically totally free, if you understand where I'm going with this. Morrowind is the closest I've ever seen that approaches that ideal. Hang on just a second. There we go. You are basically, I mean, there is a main plot line, there are guidelines, but the quest log in Morrowind, for anybody who, for example, has only played Skyrim, is going to seem a little bit off-putting. They're going to go into this and be like... Now, admittedly, Tribunal did clean up the quest log quite a bit, added some new code, which would eventually be used in Oblivion in order to help make the things a little bit more user-friendly. But overall, the general concept is basically you'd get a quest to go to a guy on the northeast part of Balmora. And you have to go talk to him, and here's his name. And from that information, you basically have to figure out where he is, figure out where his house is, or assuming he's in his house, maybe he's one of the guys roaming around, figure out where Balmora is, you know, all these things, right? You had to piece it together, basically, for all intents and purposes, by yourself. And one of the things Morrowind very much does is it basically drops you in the world. I have had several friends of mine who have never actually successfully played Morrowind because they dislike this. And this is why I'm mentioning this in kind of a neutral tone. While I, of course, obviously do enjoy this type, I freely understand the fact that it is a negative for some people. Morrowind is a game that is almost severe in its lack of direction. You get dropped there in the first little town, and there's a few quests you can do there, and there's some money you can make, and there's a couple nearby caves, and that's about the full extent of the direction you get, other than the general idea to go to Balmora. I just mentioned that. And then you're left to your own devices. It's like, let me give you an analogy, and in fact I have done this before, and I have had players complain about this before, and I had to adapt my circumstance. I have had campaigns in D&D where I have, you know, we've set up their characters, we've set up their backstories, we've set up how they've met, why they're in the party, and then I basically said, okay, here's the town you're in, and then I stopped. That's the attitude, that's the perspective Morrowind takes. Okay, here's the world, and then it just looks at you, because the next move is up to you. You understand? As I'll talk about when we get to BioShock, which is definitely coming later, gamers in general do enjoy having a degree of direction. I agree that even I myself enjoy this, and there is at the very least, having some idea of, you know, what is there, because too much openness can be overwhelming, and too much openness can be just, okay, I guess I'll go over here, and then I'll find this, and you can work into that and work into that mindset, but it is not the natural mindset of most people who are gamers. Most gamers are used to things that are quite linear by nature. Even something that is a quote-unquote sandbox, I point to the Grand Theft Autos, for example, is ultimately extremely patterned in its resultant. You know, there's a There's an icon that indicates there's a what is basically a quest over here, and there's an icon over here, and there's all sorts of stuff you can do randomly, but that doesn't have anything to do with anything. You follow me? Even something that bills itself as a sandbox is ultimately still relatively linear in its presentation. Morrowind does, of course, have some linearity to it. Duh, it's still a video game. But it is arguably the most open-ended, the most here is the world game I've ever seen. To date, I might add. On top of that, there's a couple other things that tie into this philosophy. One of the most obvious ones that I like to pull out is the fact that there's no such thing as the Essential Npc. That's something they came out with in Oblivion. For those of you who don't know what that means, any NPC that the developers decided was too important to allow to die because it would disrupt the quests or just make it impossible for you to complete the main storyline or stuff like that, that you can't. You can bring them down to 0 health and they'll pass out, and then they'll get back up. Usually there's some kind of indication of the fact that they are essential. Any given time at which you see that, it's basically meant to be a sign to you, the gamer, that, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't mess with this guy. But in Morrowind, that didn't exist. In Morrowind, if you walked up to Cadius, whatever his name is, the Blade agent in Balmora, you had the option to kill him the first time you saw him. Now, of course, the question I feel like has to be asked is why? You know, and you may be wondering why it is I'm in favor of such a thing, especially given the kind of characters I tend to play, which are what I like to call the Marios. You know, good people, in other words. Sorry. Someone I haven't talked to recently. But the reason I'm in favor of that kind of openness, I'm going to explain in two mannerisms here, okay? There's a game called Guild Wars. You may have heard of it. I have spoken praises of it before, and there's a scene that I remember distinctly. You've just gone through this whole jungle, and you come across the people you've been following, and you're trying to rescue, and they have been captured by a bunch of spiders. So you save them from the spiders, and you go up and you say, "You better explain what's going on before we cut you down right now." And then the NPC then surrounds you with a bunch of low-level goons, maybe like 8 of them, and says, "I think you should be the one to say the same thing." Now, one of the things I have found true throughout gaming history, and this might be juvenile of me, I don't actually know. I will freely admit that I consider this to be something of a flaw in my mentality. Is I have this thing called, "Oh yeah?" And it only happens when someone irritates me. If I am supposed to be intimidated by a given enemy or a given NPC, if it's done properly, I tend to be intimidated. I tend to treat them with some degree of respect or reverence or, you know, please don't kill me. But when someone is just irritating, all I want to do is smack them upside the head. And in Morrowind, I can do that. Now, let me keep going with this analogy here. In Guild Wars, I could have destroyed those 8 guys that she surrounded me with, and then looked around and be like, okay, now what? You know, because you're trying to threaten me and intimidate me like a child would on a school ground. No, I am a hardened warrior who has just survived escaping the Char and just got over the hideous mountains of doom, surviving the hostile xenophobic dwarves and then the undead. And now you're coming up here with, oh, we're gonna... No, smack! Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about, and 2 examples, if I may. I hate to segue like this, but if you'll forgive me. 2 of the most satisfying examples of actually being able to do what I'm talking about come from Fallout 3 and Chrono Trigger, respectively. In Chrono Trigger, I have just defeated Magus, the big man, you know, the guy who everyone thought was the last boss until we revealed that we're only about halfway through the game. And then you go to the past and you fight Azala, Nizbel 2, the Black Toronto, and you have all these epic, awesome battles. Now, I mention all those to point out that all of those were properly intimidating. All of those, even on New Game Plus, it's like, yes, I'm ready, because, you know, I have the proper... they're not irritating. They're threatening me and they're intimidating me properly rather than being irritating, as I mentioned earlier. Then I get to the most awesome place in the world, the Kingdom of Zeal, and get up to Dalton, who says, "Allow me to deal with these guys," and he summons the Golem. I make it a point whenever I'm New Game Plusing to destroy Golem, because he irritates me. And even when I am not New Game Plusing, it is actually not that hard to defeat the Golem if you're prepared for it. You can actually basically manipulate his AI in order to never be able to kill you. And, yeah, no, screw you. I don't have a better way of explaining that mentality because he just irritates me. And it's not intimidating, it's not imposing, it's not anything. It's not dramatic. It's like some little kid walks up in the middle of this very serious drama and walks up and says and pulls like a letter opener and says, "I have you now." And I just want to smack him. Not the kid, obviously, but you get the general concept here. The other example is Fallout 3. Right about the time when you rescue your dad and he convinces what's her face to start up the project again, and you're at a point in time in which you have to save the survivors from the conclave. Okay, most of the guys there are at the very least, despite how horrified they are of the situation, they're at the very least grateful for the help you're giving them. One of them is not. One of them does nothing but badmouth you, and it was getting kind of on my nerves. And it got to the point where he finally was like, "Look, I don't want everything to do with you," and he cusses me out, and he ends the dialogue on me. And I just looked at him for a moment, and I was like, "Okay." And I happen to have, I forget what they're actually called, but it's the ammo, it's the nuclear ammo, the stuff you can put in the big old guns. I can't think of their names either. You can reverse, you treat those as grenades, right? Which also means you can reverse pocket them into someone and then blow up. So I like to think of what happened in that scene was I looked at that guy with just a general air of annoyance, hit quick save because I did, and then I walked up, sneaked, reverse pickpocketed it into his pants, and then he looks and then he does this thing. He's like, "Oh my god!" And then this nuclear explosion goes off, which kills me too, which was immensely satisfying. Now I've gone way off topic here, sort of, but my point in bringing up all this is the reason I like having the option to take horrible vengeance upon whomever I choose to, is because occasionally characters annoy the hell out of me. In Morrowind, I've got an example for you. There's an archmage who happens to be part of the help you cure you of corpus disease, who is a I don't even want to use the word I want to use here because that's how irritating he is. And I generally make it a point of killing him after I've done with him because screw you, dude. Now, I mention this especially as a bonus because in Oblivion, in Fallout, in Skyrim, you encounter someone who irritates you and they have the essential flag, and this will happen, by the way. And all you can do is knock them over. And there is nothing, to me at the very least, there is nothing satisfying about that. It's like, PONG! And then at that point you feel just as petty as they do because you haven't done anything any more than they've done anything. And it's like, ugh, reload. There's nothing there. It is so much more satisfying to have that option. Now, I keep stressing that word because, as I've talked about before, I love having options. Even if it's something I personally will never use, it is something I tend to be in favor of because Lord knows I'm not the only gamer in the world, first of all. But second of all, because by its very definition, to me, optional means exactly that. I don't have to kill anybody. In fact, I have seen pacifist runs of Morrowind, which are things of beauty, which are really awesome, actually, because of how far you have to work in order to do so, you know? And it's awesome. I love it. It's like a pacifist of Metal Gear Solid, except worse because, you know, now you have to include mindless monsters that are coming after you as well. Now, I go into all this to really emphasize the point that I'm trying to get across here, which is to say Morrowind really is the biggest open world I've ever seen. There's actually two other things I want to talk about with regards to this point. This is still just one bullet point. One is what I call enforced exploration. I will debate whether or not this is good or bad, because ultimately this is not optional, and therefore is something that is basically forced on the player. That's why I call it enforced exploration. And whether or not you're going to like it is dependent on your own opinions. I freely admit that there are times when I don't want to go exploring, when I don't want to go over every nook and cranny to find what, you know, where this cave is, or where if I'm looking for one in specific, or indeed just looking for what's there in general. I'm not always in the mood for that. So, being forced to do so at all times, basically, does get a little bit old. There's a specific quest, and I cannot think of what it is for the life of me, nor indeed the town that's in, so I do apologize. But there's a quest where you have to go and check out what's happening with their supply of whatever mineral. It wasn't anything fancy like ebony, but, you know, they're iron mines, basically. And find out what's going on. And they tell you that the iron mines are south of town. And that's basically the extent of it for the direction you get. Now that means you have to go wandering the hillsides and navigating the roads and try to figure out where you are, based basically entirely upon your mental your ability to mentally have a good track of that kind of thing. Now I mentioned this. I have a pretty good geographical brain, okay? I have a very good sense of direction. I'm good at navigating. It's mostly because I have a good visual memory. You know, in Asheron's Call, I usually don't need chords for half the things I'm going to because I know where they are because there's going to be a tree here on the right in 10 minutes, and that's going to tell me to turn right at that point, if you follow me. So I tend to be good at that sort of thing, and I tend to enjoy that sort of thing. But I know a lot of people who aren't and who don't, and there's nothing wrong with that. Let me make this absolutely clear. This is why I'm listing this as an overall negative, this enforced exploration thing, is because sometimes someone just wants to go to the quest. They don't want to roam the hillsides looking for this mine. You know what I mean? Especially since things are not as well labeled in Morrowind as they are in other things. Most of the time you have to rely on more mundane things, like, you know, a sign that happens to be half buried under some rubble on the side of what used to be a road that points in a general direction that says the mine's that-a-way, and that's the full extent of what you have to go off of, you know? Sorry about this. I don't get to talk to her all that often. Now, that kind of thing is also compounded by the nature of the graphical design I mentioned earlier. This place very much feels like a wilderness, unless you're actually in a city or within the immediate vicinity of an urban area. Vanderfall feels very much like a wilderness, and it is clearly done on purpose. But that is also a problem because, as anybody who knows, a properly designed wilderness, and indeed a real-life wilderness, is not the easiest thing to navigate, first of all, and is very hard to get lost in, second of all, and third of all, is very hard to find what exactly you're looking for, even if you're not trying to get back. Just finding your destination is very difficult, and they very much go full in on that. Well, there are some patterns you can manage to discern after a while because, you know, they're using the same tile set over and over, relatively speaking. The fact of the matter is, after a while, it's like, oh, where the heck is this mine? It should be in this general vicinity, and you have no idea of the fact that actually that little area of underbrush over there actually conceals a hidden path which goes under this chunk of the mountain and then goes down into a cave where the actual entrance to the mine is. You see where I'm going with this? So this is something of a problem with the game, and something I feel most people need to be warned about when walking into it. There are mods that help get around this, but I'm going to leave all my mod talk in general for when I get to the little bullet point here that says mods. On top of that, there is one other thing that I do consider to be an actual benefit of Morrowind. Morrowind is huge. It is my personal opinion, having played all the Elder Scrolls, not counting the randomly generated one. That doesn't count. Let's just talk about the three more recent ones, okay? Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim. Of these three games, it is in my opinion that Morrowind is by far the largest, the biggest world that you have to explore in. It is possible, I freely admit, that part of that is because there is no fast travel, which I'll actually talk about next. But, because this is a good segue point, but even ignoring that fact, Morrowind is absolutely gargantuan. Part of that was to give that feeling that this is another world. Part of that was to give the concept of, or not the concept, to paint a canvas so that mod makers can have tons and tons of room to go ahead and plop down whatever they want to do, right? Part of that was done to add to that atmospheric tone I mentioned towards the beginning. And in my opinion, it's actually very successful on all of these points. Morrowind started my love affair of exploration in video games, to be completely honest with you. I cannot begin to express how much I enjoyed just roaming. Not actually looking for anything, not on any given quest, just going across the countryside looking for whatever I could find. And there is tons of stuff to find. Vanderfall is a very busy area. Even if you do even if you have every point of interest unlocked on the map, there is so much more than just those major points of interest. It's not even funny. And not all of it is actually tied to something either. Not everything has a quest, you know? Now I'm going to go ahead and segue this into the no fast travel thing, because that is something that anybody who has not played Morrowind but has played a more recent game needs to know about. There is no fast travel. It was not an option. Back in Morrowind, they had two other things. They had boats and silt striders, which you could hire and say, you know, each one generally connected to like 3 other towns, major towns, cities really, and you could go between them like that, and you basically got a feeling for the route, if you understand me. You know, like this guy goes here and this guy goes here. So if I need to get over here, the Mages Guild also had teleport paths that could connect between certain cities. That sort of thing, right? So it was possible to get around quickly. The catch was you had to know your way. You couldn't just pull up the map and say here. Some people like that, some people don't. I'm admittedly neutral on the subject, and I'll talk about why when I get to Oblivion review. But ultimately, the lack of fast travel is something that has to be mentioned for anybody who's picking this game up and has played more recent games. One other thing that does help to offset that is the spell Mark and the spell Recall. I'm going to mention a mod specifically here because there is a ring of Mark and Recall that exists as a mod, and I strongly recommend getting it. And the reason why is because most people don't like to raise the magic skill, specifically in Mysticism, I believe, just to get Mark and Recall. Because it is widely considered that that's basically the only real reason to pick up Mysticism, is to get Mark and Recall. The way it works is when you cast Mark, it takes your three-dimensional location, all three axes, and saves it somewhere. And thus, whenever you cast Recall, you go back to that specific spot, right? That works out rather well, all things considered, for getting around, especially if you happen to have another mod I'll mention here in a minute. But as I mentioned, getting the ring is generally considered to be preferable. Whether it's cheating or not is, of course, up to the individual's preference, but it does save you from having to put money into Mysticism when, frankly, you don't actually want to raise that at all. A couple other things that were in Morrowind that are absent from other things includes the Levitate spell, basically in its entirety. It's funny that I mentioned that specifically because there are several areas that both in lore and in game mechanics terms you basically needed Levitate to reach because that's just kind of how it is. Again, this is a high fantasy area, and it never occurred to anybody that you wouldn't have that spell in order to be able to access their area, and if you don't, then they probably don't want your company. You understand where I'm going with this. And it tended to be very useful, especially if you're, say, an archer or a mage, because you can literally just hover up into the air and stand and click on things. There are several reasons they got rid of that in the more recent games, and most of those have to do with load zone. The concept of specific zones being segregate. For example, let me use Fallout 3 as an example. You open up the map in Fallout 3, and it's this big old map. But it is important to note that that big square of area is not actually one zone. A huge amount of it is, but most of this over here is one zone. But there are portions of it, like this up here and this area here, and there's like 3 or so portions that make up the DC area that are all separate zones. What I mean by that, if you don't understand, is if you were to fly, for example, in Fallout 3, and you're in the big zone, and you start heading towards the DC area, let's layer this down so I can see it like this. As you start to head over the DC area, you see debris in your way, and normally you have to take the subway to get in, but you fly over it, and you encounter nothing, because there's actually nothing there. You understand? You're still in this zone. None of this is actually rendered. None of this is actually processed, because you haven't loaded it. You're here. You follow me? Thus you have to go. So later games would use the lack of Levitate in order to enforce you having to go through the zone lines in order to enter the areas. Now, this wasn't done for reasons of laziness or anything like that. Make no mistake. This was done in order to improve the game in an overall process, because if you have segregate zones, you can expand upon what is in a given zone greatly, because the more items that are it's actually cell is what the term is, but the more items are active in a given cell, the harder it's going to be for your game, for your computer or for your Xbox or for your PS3 or whatever, to process it. This is why something like Megaton, which ultimately isn't even that large, is nevertheless its own cell, because that way everything that is in there doesn't have to constantly be tracked by the processing while you're over here in the middle of BF nowhere. You follow me? Morrowind doesn't have that for the most part. Obviously it has indoor zones, but in general, everything you see in the overall world is one cell. And the way they got around that, or I shouldn't even say that, the problem was at the time, in order to deal with that, they have load lines, load times. The whole map is built up into blocks. Okay, you'll see this as you start to expand the map, and each one of these is effectively a region. Okay. At any given point in time, the game will have 2 regions loaded, the one you were just in and the one you just entered, or rather the one you're in now, right? And so obviously if you cross a line, you can see, oh, there's that going over there, and it will tend to load regions immediately adjacent to you if you happen to be close. It is kind of smart about this, but it does involve load times, and getting rid of those load times is why they used the cell structure in later games. You follow me? So I'm mentioning all this to get across the point that the load times is something you have to get used to in Morrowind because it's just one big cell, and yes, you can levitate, you can raise your jump and acrobatics to 30,000 and go leaping over the mountain. I'm sure you've seen that YouTube video, but the load times is what you have to basically live with in order to deal with that. Now, at a modern computer, speaking from experience, those load times were virtually non-existent, especially with the Overhaul kit, which happened to streamline that process significantly, which was good. But it is something worth noting. Also, Morrowind is probably, of all the Elder Scrolls I've played, the one with the worst memory leak. Now, I didn't have any problems when I was playing with the Overhaul kit, so it's possible something in the kit actually fixed that memory leak. But I mention it just in case, if you don't want to use the Overhaul, or if you don't have the interest in it, or you're playing on the consoles, that memory leak problem basically means that after a certain time of playing, you have to stop. Just close it down, and then start it up again, occasionally after having rebooted your computer, depending on how bad it got. That's just kind of a reality of it. One of the other things that they introduced in later Flinging Your Phones games is the concept of... Hang on just a second. The concept of dynamic events and random events. Fallout 3 is probably the poster child for this, but if you've played Skyrim, you've also seen this as well. Back in Morrowind, the idea of random or dynamic events basically didn't exist. It's, instead, what you would have would be static, okay? For example, if you were going along the road and you see a young maiden happens to be standing there who is smitten with the man who just stole her goods and wants you to go take a message to him, any given time you play the game, that woman is still going to be there, okay? Hang on just a second. Now, I mention that because a lot of people have taken that type of information and assumed that Morrowind is going to be a much more... I guess linear is the word I'm looking for, kind of gameplay, as in there's going to be no variation. That's the whole point of those random events, is to give you a different experience each time you play, right? The truth of the matter is, however, Morrowind can vary significantly on your based on your playstyle as well, of course, but also in the way you go through it. Allow me to explain. Morrowind did something that very few other games of its like have done. Basically, you have... Okay. In Oblivion, you had the Mages Guild, the Thieves Guild, the Fighters Guild, the Dark Brotherhood, and I believe that's it, actually, as the major side arcs, in addition to the main arc, the additional organizations you could join, right? Because joining organizations has been a big deal in all Elder Scrolls. In Skyrim, you know, same basic thing. You had what is effectively the Fighters Guild, the Mages Guild, the Thieves Guild, the Dark Brotherhood, and again, I'm actually having trouble coming up with another one. I mention this not to put those games down, but to emphasize the fact that in Morrowind there's something more like 10 different organizations you can join. Now, you may say, oh my god, but wait a minute, I think about this for a moment, and I realize that just means that there's that much more to do, and it's still going to be just as linear. And so, my response to you is, well, that's a very reasonable assumption if they weren't mutually exclusive in many cases. That's the key point right there. The fact that so many of them are mutually exclusive with others means that any given playthrough, you can't join the Thieves Guild, for example. You instead join the Assassin's Guild, the Kamana Tong, or whatever they're called. You instead join you joined the Imperial Legion instead of the religious group whose name I can't even think of right now. You get my point. Having that mutual exclusivity meant that having so many factions gave you options, basically, is what I'm getting at here. You actually have choices. Do you want to join any of them? Do you want to join some of them? Do you want to join that one in this playthrough? Well, that means you can't join this other one, but, you know, whatever. Similarly, the 3 houses that you can join, which anybody who's been playing my D&D campaign will probably recognize the names of, Redoran, Hlelu, and Telvanni, are mutually exclusive. You get to join one. Yes, there are mods that fix that, but I personally prefer not using those mods. I think it makes more sense having only the one. But I do mention it for the sake of completion. And just so forth and so on. What I'm trying to get across here is that even though there are no even though there are no dynamic events, there is simply a massive amount of content to go through, and you can't do it all at once. Let me give you probably the most extreme example of this. Becoming a vampire. Becoming a vampire in Morrowind was something that was actually a rumor for a long time before we finally figured out how to do it. In short, if you choose to become a vampire, you're kind of stuck that way. Now, there is actually a way to cure your vampirism, in which case it'll reset it. But when I say you're stuck, What I mean is that the moment you become a vampire, your faction is set to hostile to basically everyone. That means you can't even sell. You can't even talk to a merchant and say, please buy my stuff. You can't talk to any quest NPCs. You can't advance anything. All you can do is go on a rampage and destroy stuff, right? And ironically enough, that is very appropriate for the lore of Vanderfall in general, because vampires are thought of differently depending on the setting, depending on the region, because there are different types of vampirism within Tamriel. And the ones in Vanderfall are not nice, and they're not kind, and they need to be destroyed. And of course, you can become a vampire hunter, and so forth and so on. And yes, you can become a werewolf too, and a werewolf hunter if you choose. That's actually in the Blood Moon expansion. But anyways, I just mentioned all of this to get across the point that Morrowind truly is a world that you can roam in at your own pace, do it however you choose to. There are limitations, as I've already started to mention. There are downsides. I don't want to be singing the praises of a game that is flawed. Well, okay, yes I do, but I want to sing those praises while at the same time giving you a degree of warning. And in case anyone's wondering, I've been approaching this video with the perspective that the people watching it in general have not played Morrowind, because I actually know a fairly large number of people personally who have played Oblivion, who've played Fallout 3, who've played Fallout New Vegas, who've played Skyrim, who never played Morrowind, and there is so much to talk about with regards to that game that I find it difficult to do so without getting into a however long video. I don't have the thing up, so I don't know how long I've been talking for so long. And I'm only like 3 or 4 bullet points into my list here, but you get the point. There's so much to talk about in this game, because ultimately Morrowind is a very different game from all the other ones. All the other ones I mentioned, Oblivion up through Skyrim, ultimately you could group those all into the same kind of category over here. Everything is a variation of itself. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying, in general, if you've played one, you know how to play another one, right? Morrowind is over here. It is different in just about every major way. It is different. Obviously, you still have the Elder Scrolls perspective and the same general leveling system. I'll talk about that next, I guess. But it's over here, and so it takes more to get into that, especially if all you're used to is over this. You follow me? Let's talk about that leveling. The leveling system thing actually has to do with several points, which I will mention all as one little thing here. First of all, let's talk about the vendors in Morrowind. In Morrowind, the vendors have a static amount of gold, and I shouldn't say static, that's actually being... Let me try to explain by using a contrast, okay? In Oblivion, a vendor has a gold amount. That is the most amount they will pay for any given item, right? You can raise that through disposition, you can raise that through your own mercantility skill, but the general concept is that's their gold limit per item. Given that fact, they effectively have infinite gold. You can just fling items at them and, there you go, right? In Morrowind, that is not the case. In Morrowind, the gold amount of every given merchant in the entire game is saved at any given point in time. So if you return to a merchant that you were talking to some time ago, and he, you sold him several things, so he's out of gold, you can't sell him anything else because he's out of gold. Now, there are certain merchants and certain events which will reset that amount, but in general, you have to do this. If you want to sell something that is expensive, you have to get their gold high enough in order to sell it to them, which means you have to buy and sell and buy and sell. There's actually a whole complicated process involved in order to force their gold amount up so that you can then sell this item that's worth the 10,000 gold or whatever. And that can be either interesting or incredibly irritating, depending on your opinion. I'm not going to cast judgment on either perspective. I personally tend to think that's really irritating. I'm one of the mods I very much did use was one that gave more gold to merchants because, hey, and there was actually another mod which I enjoyed, which basically created this island that you could warp to, and on the island was merchants who had a ridiculous amount of gold that reset regularly. So there you go, you're good. But even ignoring that, acquiring money in Morrowind is not the easiest thing in the world, and that's interesting for reasons I'll get into when I start really talking about the leveling. But at the same time, ignoring the merchants thing. Let's say we've used the mod I just mentioned. We have fixed the merchants problem. Ignoring that, getting money is enjoyable, in my opinion, in Morrowind. First of all, the obvious way to really get yourself started is to join the Fighters Guild, because they just give you they give you missions and you get paid for it. You are a mercenary for all intents and purposes. That's what the Fighters Guild is. But of course, there are other ways to get gold depending on your class. For example, let's say you're a thief kind of character, either archer or melee based, doesn't really matter. One of the best and most enjoyable ways I tended to find to get gold was go into the mines. Now let me explain briefly. In the lore of this setting, the Empire has basically occupied Morrowind, and Vanderfall in specific. And Vanderfall is one of the most prolific, one of the most wealthiest sources of ebony and glass, which is used to make armor and weapons throughout most of the continent, right? So the Empire has possession of those, and actually trading in ebony and glass is technically illegal by Imperial law, because all of that, by decree, belongs to the Emperor. You follow me? So that's why I mentioned you have to be sneaky, because if you get caught, the guards will come after you, and that'll be bad. But if you're good at it, you can sneak your way through those mines and steal a whole bunch of ebony and glass and have a decent source of income. And the best part is you can just kind of keep it on your person, assuming you don't get caught in the future, such that anytime you need something, you can just dole out a few pieces of glass or ebony in order to pay whatever it is you need for, right? Which I rather liked. If you're a mage, of course, you have a slightly harder time of it, but at the same time, one of the things you can do as a mage is to go find any of the given bandit camps, or any of the areas where the Daedric worshippers are, and just kind of go to town, if you know what I mean. And this is also something you can do as a fighter, admittedly, but the point remains, it's a source of income. And the point I'm trying to emphasize here, I'm trying to give specific examples, and I don't want to give too many, because that would take forever. The point is you have options. I keep using that word. You have options. You have so many different sources of revenue that you can use within this game, and so many of them make a degree of sense, either in lore or in gameplay, and tend to be enjoyable. In general, unless you really know what you're doing, you're not going to have a huge amount of income in this game, not until you get to a certain point where enemies are actually dropping ebony armor or something like that. But for most of the game, your money supply is going to be somewhat restricted, but not in a way that's actually irritating, as long as you use the merchant mod that I mentioned. Now that, I feel, is worth mentioning, especially in regards to leveling in Morrowind. Most people I know who have played Morrowind all came to the same conclusion I did, that money equals exp, okay? Now, I say that it's not quite a one-to-one ratio, but if you've played Oblivion or Skyrim or anything like that, you know that you could train at a trainer for a certain amount of gold a certain many times a day in order to augment your leveling. But of course, the way you leveled in those games was you actually used those skills, right? In Morrowind, most people agree that it is much more useful to go ahead and use the trainers pretty much exclusively to level. That is to say, the only thing preventing you from leveling is your gold supply, and you can raise whatever it is you feel you need to. Generally you raise combat skills first, but you get the point. In order to level, in order to be stronger, in order to get better. That admittedly took me a while to figure out, because that was kind of a unique concept to me at the time. But once you understand that, you understand the value of money, because ultimately there's not much you can spend monetarily on that matters, other than ingredients, repairs, that kind of thing, other than leveling. But leveling itself is one of those great benefits of the financial system, and one of the reasons I like the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that the money supply is somewhat limited unless you really go out of your way to get it, which of course you can. Options, like I said. So that's something to be kept in mind as well. The leveling system and the path at which you take to level is basically completely determined by you and how you choose to do it. Now, what's my next point here? The scaling. This is important to note. Okay. Let me actually pull up the camera so I can see what I'm doing here. Okay. Most older styled games had I hesitate to call it a problem, but a different mentality of how they approach scaling. You're probably wondering what the heck I'm talking about with regards to scaling. If you have 10 acrobatics skill, you can, let's make this nice and flat. You can jump this high, okay? If you have 20, you can then jump 20, right? And if you have 30, you can jump triple that, okay? This isn't exact, but you get the point. I hope you're following me on this, because this is the point. You'll notice that from 10 to 30, there is no variation in the line. If we were to graph this out, this is the scaling of most older games. It is, I'm doing a little off because I'm weird, but it's basically linear, is what I'm saying. Now, whether or not that's a problem or a good thing is completely up to you. But I mention it because in Morrowind it is quite easy to make yourself potions of increase my ability to make potions, and then use those to make better potions, and use those to make better potions, all while you're in the menu, which means the game is paused, so even if that potion only lasts 1 second, you can still, you just keep doing this forever until it reaches the point where you can make yourself super potions, and blah blah blah. Now, I don't actually do that. I think that really is a degree of cheap and unnecessary, but I mention it because even ignoring that, there's more you can do with a system like that than you can with anything else. Modern games, having learned this lesson, tend to do this kind of a scale, where it tapers off and it basically plateaus at a certain point, and you no longer gain increase. Obviously, there's some limitations in that, but that's the general concept. If I might diverge for just a second to really explain, way back in Final Fantasy III on the NES, they had the linear curve. So if you were high enough level and you had enough stat in whatever it was either agility or strength, I can't remember, the number of attacks you got per round went up significantly, to the point where if you were like a level 99 monk, you know how they do the animations like this? You'd be stuck here, like this, as he's doing this animation for like a good 20 seconds, until the attack would go through and you'd see like 55 hits go through, and then it would switch to the other arm and stuff like that. In the more recent games, that scales like this. It tapers off, and as such, you only get like 17 attacks, and that's actually at the most. So Morrowind had that problem as well. A lot of people abused it, of course, but it also is worth noting that there are ways to buff yourself and stack buffs on yourself in order to increase your stats, that kind of thing. You can use the console to increase your stats to stupid levels, things like that. In general, if you're playing legitimately and not trying to be cheap, it's not going to be a big issue, with one exception, which I really do feel like I have to mention, even though this is kind of spoilery. I shouldn't even say spoilery, but I prefer people who examine this on their own right, because most people make the exact same choice when it comes to this. Right after you leave Seyda-Neen, which is the first town, the tutorial town, you come across, you hear this, "Whoa!" and you see this guy plummet from the sky in front of you and fall to his death. Now, he has some scrolls next to him and a journal, and you could read the journal, and he's talking about how he's invented this new transportation system, and it works wonderfully, and everyone is going to be jealous of him, because, even though they keep mocking him, he will show them. And then he has a scroll, several scrolls actually, which I forget what they're called. But what they do is increase your acrobatics by a huge factor. And I have known so many people who will pick up the scrolls and use one, and then look around and be like, "Oh, nothing happened." And then as they're going about, they will just kind of casually jump, because people tend to just casually jump as they're playing games, maybe hopping on a rock, and then he's off, because it scales like this. So when you have 10,000 acrobatics, your jump suddenly goes, whoa, like you're on a rocket. Now, the beautiful part about this is acrobatics serves two functions in Morrowind. One, how high you can jump, and how fast, obviously. And two, how far you can fall. In other words, to put this linearly, if you have a 10,000 jump skill, and it's just 10,000 acrobatics, if you jump, you'll jump way up here, really, really, really high, obviously, to the point where nothing is rendered for several minutes as you plummet. But when you hit the ground, you'll be fine. You will take no damage, because that is the limit of how much you can fall, the same amount that you can jump, right? These scrolls only last a few seconds, so you no longer have a 10,000 acrobatic skill when you land and die horribly on the other side of the island. So, yeah, there are some amusing things that come as a resultant of that. What else do we got here? Money, talk about that. Lots of content, no essential NPCs, already mentioned that, no fast travel. I'm actually kind of going through these pretty quick, aren't I? Let's talk about the expansions. I strongly recommended that you at the very least get Tribunal. Tribunal is the clear and decisive point at which they were trying to modernize Morrowind. They improved the journal, they improved their styling of zones, they used cells and things like that more often. It was clear they were moving forward in terms of technology and presentation, and you could see bits and pieces of Oblivion within Tribunal. I also mentioned Tribunal because it very directly continues the main plot. I haven't talked about the main plot yet. I don't want to get too spoilery because, again, so many people I know wanted this video because they've never played Morrowind. But the main plot of Morrowind proper does continue within Tribunal to some degree or another. So I strongly recommend, if you are getting this, that you finish the primary quest chain in Morrowind and then pick up Tribunal, especially since Tribunal is significantly more difficult than the entire rest of Morrowind for obvious reasons. But I have to give definite props to Tribunal because it is extremely well done. There's a great deal of additional subtlety and nuances. The characters are far more fleshed out than they are even in Morrowind, and they were pretty fleshed out in Morrowind too, all sorts of things like that. It is very well done, and the villain, who I will not mention here for fear of spoilers, is arguably one of the better presentations of a villain in the Elder Scrolls series that I've seen personally. Probably one of my favorites, all things considered. Um, Blood Moon, which is I really enjoy Blood Moon. It doesn't have anything particularly to do with the main plot, but it is still suitably epic, and it is still suitably awesome. And it has to do with one of the Daedric princes, I can't remember his name, who deals with werewolves, and basically going on the Great Hunt, finding him, cutting off the source of werewolves that are happening on the island, and successfully saving the day and blah blah blah. And of course, there's tons of content as usual. Now, hang on just a second. One of the other things I really have to mention in regards to Tribunal and Blood Moon, most people who've played modern Bethesda games don't know what I mean when I say the difference between a DLC and an expansion. I have talked before about this from a fundamental perspective and from a corporate perspective and from a developing perspective, but on the terms of the gaming perspective, in general, an expansion is going to have more content. That's really what it comes down to. Whether or not it's higher quality is debatable and indeed variable. It kind of depends on the circumstances, but it is generally widely considered, 100% of the time basically, that an expansion is going to have more content. This is why I call both Tribunal and Blood Moon expansions. There is a huge amount of content in both of them, and most of it is awesome. I only say most of it because I personally can't think of anything that isn't. But of course, I don't want to put words into your mouth if you don't find it awesome. But in general, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of additional content and a way to keep going, if you know what I mean, which is awesome. And one of the things I liked is the way they did vampires in Morrowind. As I said, basically you become a vampire, you lock yourself off from everything except for the Cure the Vampire quest. But as a werewolf, as long as you're careful, you can still go about and do quests and do whatever you want to do while being a werewolf. You just have to be very careful about who you change in front of and that kind of thing, right? Very simple, actually. And really well done, I thought. It made being a werewolf actually worth it, as opposed to being a vampire, which most people, myself included, didn't actually consider it to be worthwhile. One of the other things I have to mention as a little aside is that Blood Moon occurs on an island called Solstheim, which I may be pronouncing incorrectly. And that island may sound familiar to any of you who are fans of the modern series, because that's where Dragonborn is occurring, the DLC that isn't quite out yet for Skyrim, which I'm really looking forward to. Now, one last thing I want to talk about here with regards thereto is Daga Thor. Now, I said I wouldn't mention the villain of the next game, or rather the villain of Tribunal, but I don't feel bad mentioning the villain of Morrowind proper, because he's well publicized very early on. It's not exactly it's like saying that the villain of Star Wars is Darth Vader. That's not really a surprise, is it? Now, of course, arguably he's not the villain, but you get my point. It's the same general thing. Daga Thor is the villain, okay? Get over it. I personally think that of the main villains of the Elder Scrolls series, Daga Thor is probably my favorite of all of them. While Daga Thor, or however you say his name, was certainly interesting in his own right, ultimately it is, and as has been revealed later, he was basically just kind of a puppet and your classic scheming vizier kind of character. And the guy in Oblivion, whose name I suddenly can't think of, can't even be qualified. I'm talking about the Daedric Prince. Can't even be qualified to be the actual main villain, because ultimately he never interact with him. He has zero characterization. All you know is that this is all his plot. What you do encounter is Menker Cameron. Now, this is an interesting facet. Menker Cameron, the President Eden in Fallout 3, and God, I suddenly can't think of his name. Anduin, all basically receive what amounts to a single scene in total characterization for them. It's something that they seem to like to do for some reason. Daga Thor is no exception, but I'll get to that in a minute. Every single one of them, basically all you know about them comes from what they've done and what other people say about them, and then you actually encounter them, and you usually learn more. You usually learn hidden details. That's usually where any given twists happen, that kind of thing. For example, the biggest twist in Oblivion, which I will not give away here, is given away when you are confronting Menker Cameron within his paradise, for example. And the twist about Eden being a computer, and the whole virus thing, and what's going on with the Conclave, which I did just spoil, but whatever. That's another thing with regards to Fallout 3 that's given away in that scene. So these tend to be scenes that they build up, and they tend to deliver on. That being said, Menker Cameron is arguably one of my favorites, definitely my second favorite of these villains. It helps the fact that they had an awesome voice actor for him. Anduin was nothing short of pathetic. I'm sorry. It was one of the biggest downsides of Skyrim, in my opinion, that Anduin was just, But Daga Thor was brilliant. one of the reasons I feel that is because he was such a unique type of villain. You could argue that he's your classic egotistical, insane guy. I would argue against that. I would argue that Daga Thor is someone who actually has some complexities to him, who you can't just summarize with a single sentence, in other words, which I like. I like it when my villains have some complexity to them. I like when everything has some complexity to it, as I'll mention when I get to the Kingdom Hearts series. But ultimately, I really enjoyed the portrayal of someone from everyone's perspective. You hear about him from the churches, which portray him as the devil, basically. I mean, I think they actually say that literally. You hear about him from the other individuals involved, Vivek and Almalexia, and the guy whose name I can't think of. You hear about his perspective from the writings, which were told from Nerevarine perspective. You hear about him from the perspective of one of the Daedric lords, Ashura. And then at the very end of the game, you encounter him himself, and he gives you the final perspective his own. And what I love about this is every single one of these perspectives is effectively flawed, if you know what I mean. Because it's someone's perspective. It's not literal fact. It's how they perceived something. And so from all these pieces, you are left to come up with your own interpretation of Daga Thor and what you thought about him and what you thought about his methods and his motives and whether or not he was right or wrong or partially right or partially wrong. It was brilliant. It was beautiful, and the way they presented this makes him, in my opinion, arguably the most well-characterized villain in the history of the Elder Scrolls series. Definitely of the main villains, and without question, my favorite of the main villains. Even though the last boss itself wasn't a big epic fight of doom, I like the way it was presented. I don't want to give away too much, but suffice it to say that there's this divine item that you're trying to deal with, and ultimately, while you fight Daga Thor, defeating him isn't really possible as long as that item still exists, and your actual goal is to get rid of it, not just to get rid of but to get rid of the influences it has had on various other people throughout the duration of the history. And the more you pay attention to the story and the lore, the more you get all of this. I don't want to spoil everything in the universe here. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of reasons why getting rid of this item is a good idea. And you find yourself in this place, and you equip the artifacts that you've gathered, and you don't attack Daga Thor with them, you attack the divine item to destroy it. And it's beautiful because the voice actor actually is like, no, don't, wait! And he sounds genuinely panicked because it never occurred to Daga Thor that you would do anything other than try to defeat him. The thought of getting rid of that was just, oh my god. And of course you succeed, and it changes the history of the island forever, and then of course everything goes to hell in like a century, or however long it is in the books, I don't remember. But anyways, brilliantly done, very well done. And I mentioned some time ago when I was being asked, I believe it was with regards to Half-Life, the differing ways that you could do a last boss sequence, you know, the finale, the last boss, the ending, and the conclusion there, or however you want to jumble these up. And I was asked again, is there a way to do it other than this? You know, the FF4 style, as I like to style it. Morrowind is another beautiful way to do that whole sequence perfectly. You know, to do it didn't do the slow descent into total deadness and creepiness that Half-Life did. Instead, it maintained this very strange level of just kind of half tension, half quakiness, for lack of a better term. As there's no big fanfare. There's no we're going to the last boss. It's just like this. But it manages to be so atmospheric and so impacting without having to bludgeon you over the head with it, basically. It's very creepy in its own right, but it's not Half-Life creepy. You know, it's not down here. It's up here, which is just terrifying in its own right. Brilliantly done. Brilliantly constructed. And another one of the reasons why Morrowind is my favorite. Now, mods. My last point here. I strongly recommend you mod Morrowind. I really do. Because, basically. Let's talk about a couple of the mods that I remember. I don't remember names, I apologize, and I don't have the files anymore, at least not anywhere accessible. But let's talk about a few of the mods I do genuinely recommend. First of all, I mentioned that the mark and recall ring. There is another one that helps with transportation as well with regards to that. Let me actually take a step back. One of the most popular, there were two types of mods that were extremely popular back when the modding community was very strong within Morrowind. One was housing, and two was content, quest hubs, that kind of thing. I just feel like pointing out this second point here now because it is so rare to see actual content added to more modern games like Skyrim and stuff. Yes, there are such things, don't mistake me, of course there are. But there was so many quests, and indeed quest hubs, that people added to Morrowind just because that was what so many people assumed the modding was for, was to add content, if you follow me. And that's one of the things I loved about Morrowind. For example, there was a whole thing. It was a whole faction you could join and rank yourself up in, just like you could any of the other factions, called the Society of the Cloud or something like that. And at the end of the day, after you went through all their content, after you saw their whole storyline, you gained a unique spell which would change the weather within the area, which doesn't actually have any real effect other than changing the weather. But it was cool, it was interesting, and it was more content to do. I loved it. But with regard to housing, lots of housing mods tended to be well labeled when they were, this housing mod is basically a cheat mod because it has all the stat books in it and stuff like that. Um, but a number of housing mods were just designed to be interesting or engaging, and most of them fit within the lore. Obviously, the concept of an airship mod was very popular, but this is Morrowind we're talking about. The idea of a moving airship was virtually impossible. And yet, there was a mod that I used as my airship one primarily. It was a Dwemer floating fortress, which by itself sounds awesome for anybody who knows what I'm talking about. But not only that, it was mobile. Now, obviously, it didn't actually move. This is sheer brilliance that he pulled this off with the limited tools available in Morrowind. You could park it at any given city. There was a console you had there, and you could say, I want to move this thing to Balmora, and the whole thing would move there. And I mention that because the concept of moving a structure within the cell like that is not exactly an easy one within the confines of the game. But he did it, or she did it, whoever actually made the mod. I don't know off the top of my head, obviously. And so you could basically set your marker recall on this thing, use it to move around throughout the world, and basically have what is effectively an airship, and effectively a fast travel system within your floating Dwemer fortress. Now, the beautiful part about this was I didn't consider it a cheat mod because it was hideously expensive. Remember I mentioned earlier how hard it is to come across money in this game? Every individual functional part of this house, this fortress, was like 100,000 gold each, which is not a small amount, as anybody who's played Morrowind will tell you. And so coming across that money was what I considered to be one of my main goals during that given playthrough when I would use that. Or actually, I used it more than once, obviously, but you get the point. That would be one of the main uses of money, and in fact, I would have to be living with a good balance of leveling and saving up for my massive, awesome house because it was just so expensive. Brilliant thing. There were several other add-ons that added, like, arenas, for example, which is funny because then Oblivion would actually add an arena in the main game. But, where you could go in and fight, and you could keep whatever you got off of the corpse, and, you would get money for it. Just stuff like that. I could not even begin to list how much content people added through mods. I really couldn't. It would take me so long, and it would take me so much effort and thought just to go down the list. So I strongly recommend you look into any mods of that variety. On top of that, like I mentioned the Dwemer Fortress, there were many other housing mods that were much more down-to-earth and yet nevertheless very enjoyable. Balmora is an extremely... Palmora and Caldera are both extremely... Caldera, is that right? I think so. Extremely popular areas to have houses in. So make sure that whatever one you're getting doesn't conflict with something else, because a lot of people tend to put stuff in the same relatively empty spaces within Balmora and Caldera. That being said, I remember one distinctly that was a library, basically. I mean, obviously it had a bed, but that was it. It was a bed and then a ton of books. And it wasn't just the stat books, it was all of the books. I didn't mention this earlier because I forgot, but one of the things I really enjoyed in the exploration aspect of Morrowind was the fact that there was so much literature in Morrowind. This is the first Elder Scrolls to really do this, to really flesh out the entire world and the setting and the characterization through its literature, through its novels, through the things you would find of written works and historical bits. You learned so much about that setting by reading those, and I loved finding a new book and just perusing and just stopping everything and just reading my way through it. In Skyrim, if you have played it, you know that you can buy bookshelves and basically put books into them as though it was a chest, and the books will self-arrange, which is an awesome feature, by the way. In Morrowind, obviously, that didn't exist. What you could do is you could drop the book, and then you have to pick it up and manually kind of get it up there on the bookshelf. It probably will not surprise anyone to know that I was one of those people who was carefully, tediously getting every single book lined up in my bookshelf one by one because it's me, And I loved collecting every single one of those pieces of literature across the world. So when I saw this mod, which is well after I had succeeded at getting all the books, I found that to be awesome because then I could go and read whenever I wanted to, basically, without having to go back and get every single piece of book one by one. which is a nice feature. Other mods, I mentioned the Merchant mod. I almost consider that, of the mods I've mentioned, the Merchant mod and the Overhaul kit are probably the two I would consider to be basically required to enjoy Morrowind in a modern setting, because the ability to actually sell items to a merchant whose gold doesn't go away, like, immediately is beyond helpful when it comes to a user-friendliness affair. And the problem is there's so many mods that I find myself thinking, well, where do I go from there? You know, the magic retooling, or the fact that, you know, the addition of companions. There wasn't actually a concept of having a companion NPC in Morrowind. There was code that supported it. This was true in Oblivion as well, but it is mods that added it to both. It wasn't actually until Fallout 3 that really became a vanilla feature. Yes, I know there's exceptions to that, especially within spells. Just bear with me here. But there were add-ons that actually added whole companions to Morrowind. I never used them personally, but that's because I never could use companions in general in any Elder Scrolls. I know many people who can't imagine playing Skyrim, for example, without a companion of some sort. So if you are playing Morrowind and are that kind of person, I strongly recommend you look into one of them. There are several that have been very well designed and add a great deal and are very well coded. So, you know, there you go. Um, Honestly, I'm having trouble coming up with other specific examples except for one, which is something along the lines of Diabolic Deal or something like that. It's basically you can sell your soul for a specific buff, which is very powerful. Now, in general, that buff is so powerful it's going to feel like cheating. Here's the catch. You have a certain amount of days will pass before basically demons will start coming and showing up and trying to take your soul because you just sold your soul and they're trying to collect. And at a certain point in time, that's going to get not just irritating, that's going to get to the point where you're not going to survive it, even with your buffs, unless you're really good, which is possible. But there are several ways out of that. For example, you can just rescind on the deal, basically, get your soul back and lose the power. Or you can go on an extremely difficult long-term quest in order to drag your way through and successfully get several other souls to satisfy Davy Jones. I mean, whatever his guy's name is. In order to do so, it was very well designed, and it was very well balanced in its own right, because it's not just it wasn't just a cheat mod, of which there were of course several. It was more like here's a cheat, but you're gonna have to pay for it if you follow me, which I liked, and I liked the way they presented that. That's another mod I do recommend. Past that, I can't come up with any specific individuals. Now, I have no idea how long this has been. It's been commented recently that the length of my videos has to do with how good the game is I'm looking at. I disagree with that fervently. But I want to make this absolutely clear for anyone who has any doubts still. Even despite all of the difficulties and problems that Morrowind has, I still enjoyed playing it just as much as I did back in the... Actually, more so, because the mods had improved the experience, obviously. But that game is so huge, so rich, so diverse, so flavorful. There is so much atmosphere in Morrowind. It doesn't have an extremely tight... you know, I'm actually going to take that back. The primary quest chain is actually really well done in Morrowind. I was going to say it doesn't have the most tightly done plot in the world, but in all honesty, amongst the Elder Scrolls, in my opinion, it has the best major plot of all the Elder Scrolls. It is extremely well done, extremely well written, extremely well presented. It is old, and you have to get over that. I'm sorry, let me phrase my statement a little bit more correctly. You have to overcome the oldness as an obstacle to enjoying the game. Such as, say, Fallout 1 or 2, for example, to use another, or Baldur's Gate is another good example. You know, these games are old games that are harder to play. That's just because they were older and we didn't know how to do things as well back then. But once you do, what you'll find is an absolutely incredible game underneath, which I cannot possibly recommend enough. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut this off. And I will talk to you all later.